Welcome to the Climate and Coordination RCAST, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and RChain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, RChain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody to this week's installment of the Climate and Coordination RCAST. We are really excited to have a special guest with us today. And Daryl, I'm going to let you start this one off. I'm so excited to have Pedro with us. So please just introduce him, and I'm so excited to see what we talk about today.
Okay, so I guess a few weeks ago I approached the Climate and the Blockchain and Climate Institute, and I heard back from Dr. Pedro Baiz, and so we had a chat for, I don't know, it's about an hour or so, and just kind of got to know what each other's organizations were all about, and so I asked him to come and join us on this call. So yeah, welcome, Dr. Pedro Baiz.
Thank you very much for the intro and the invitation, Daryl. Well, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. It was a very interesting conversation, the one we had a few weeks ago. Very, very good to hear about what you guys are doing. And yeah, always, happy to talk about technology and sustainability. I think that there is a lot of synergies between those two. And well, now that we're actually trying to come back in recovery after big pandemic, definitely it's technology has a huge huge role to play, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to the converted here as well.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued, Pedro. It's Steve Ross Talbot here. I'm intrigued because I guess you're in London.
Yes, I'm in London. I've been here now.
I'm 50 miles south of you, just north of Brighton.
Oh, that's good.
And the coincidences don't end there. So I noticed that you're at Imperial, and I do most of my academic collaboration with Professor Nobuko Yoshida in the computing department at Imperial. And underlying RChain, now Greg's on the call, is a formal mathematics about how communication happens and about how things collaborate so that they don't have unintended consequences, shall we say. And that mathematics goes way back in time academically, to the days of Alan Turing and Alonzo Church and von Neumann, and then ends up going through radical change, well, not radical change, going through evolutionary change, I think we would probably say, to encompass how single processes work and how we might look at them mathematically so that we can ask questions of them. And then sort of around the late 80s, early 90s, there were a couple of professors in computer science, Tony Hoare being one of them, and Professor Robin Milner being the other, who were looking at how do we describe multiple processes somehow collaborating, a bit like a blockchain, right? But in a generic way. How do we truly understand their behavior and what's good behavior and what's bad behavior, and therefore how do we prevent bad behavior? And so around that time that CSP was invented by Tony Hoare, and then following that shortly after, for which he got a Turing Award, Robin Milner does PyCalculus, and then gets a Turing Award not just for PyCalculus, but for 3 separate things that he did in computer science. Probably the greatest of the Turing Award recipients thus far. So he comes up with PyCalculus, and suddenly a little group in Imperial forms to look at what's called process algebra. And one of those, this is a great segue, Greg, I'm really building you up. One of those that was working at Imperial at that time was none other than Greg Meredith, the founder of RChain. So you've got 3 people, including yourself, on this call, all who have an intimate connection with Imperial College London.
Nice one, Steve.
Pedro, very small word.
It is.
Yeah. Hello, Greg. Yeah.
Hello. It's nice to meet you. So I think you and Daryl may have shared a little bit about your organization, but I think the wider RChain community may not know so much. So would you mind giving a little bit more detailed introduction to your organization, what your focus is, what your current activities are, what projects you're engaged in, and who are the sort of major players that are involved in your organization and your partners?
Totally makes sense. A bit of background about the Blockchain and Climate Institute. So it is a non-for-profit think tank, which is, well, as many things in the area of blockchain, relatively new. It emerged out of conversations from COP. COP, for those that are not familiar, COP stands for the Conference of the Parties. It was where the Paris Agreement was signed. In 2015, for example, the COP took place in Paris, and that's where the name of the Paris Agreement comes about. And yeah, in those conferences, which actually I joined the last one in Madrid in December, and this year we should have had the next one here in the UK. There is a gathering of thousands and thousands of people, from obviously the politicians that sometimes take the headlines, particularly when they don't get along between them and conversations fail, like last December. But also there are many other organizations, whether it's companies, non-for-profits, academics, etc., that go there to talk and discuss, well, how to address this big problem of climate change. And so throughout those conversations, it was about, I believe, about 2-3 years ago, that the idea of trying to create a group in which was focused on DLTs, blockchains, distributed ledgers, to specifically support climate change came about. 2 organizations emerged probably from that. One of them is a Climate Chain Coalition, CCC, which is more a membership organization. So companies, I don't know, that are interested in climate change can join that. It's a good network, again, very well connected with people at the UN and so on. And the other one that emerged is probably BCI, Blockchain Climate Institute. And the idea is that it is not a membership organization, because that's a CCC. It's more, instead of focusing on organizations, it's focused actually on individuals and on policy and on research. So we're trying to work with governments, which obviously are the ones that sometimes hold the key, for whether it's via regulations or taxes and so on, to support this transition towards a greener, more sustainable future. And but they don't know, most of these politicians do not know in detail what technology can do for them sometimes. And specifically, a blockchain is one very good example, because most of them are still associated to cryptos. I said, no. These 2 things are distributed ledgers, are much broader thing. It's and cryptocurrency is just one of the many applications. And in fact, we are not working, in fact, in BCI in cryptos at all, in fact. Not that we cannot consider, by the way, but we are working in other areas where there is, for example, emissions trading schemes, for example, which is carbon trading, monitoring carbon and trading carbon from organizations, to energy, for example, exchanges, for example, energy tokens, to many other applications. In, for example, my area is finance, for example, for blockchain green bonds. So these are the other areas where we're interested in. I am only heading one of the research divisions, the finance division, but we have two others. One of them is on legal aspects, law, and the other one is in general research, where they go into detail into the real economy, whether it's agriculture, energy, transport, well, you name it. And yeah, there is a lot of engagement, for advisory policy, which we have a specific division as well created this year, only to engage politicians. So I hope that gives you kind of a broad introduction. We have grown substantially, from 2-3 years ago, only 5-10 people. I joined last year. Now we are reaching 100 volunteers. And yeah, and continue growing, I guess. And yeah, as a think tank, we believe a lot in openness, obviously supporting sustainable solutions, and as actually I demonstrate with my different roles, it's also collaborative organization. So I'm actually have a role at Imperial, as was discussed before, which is also part-time. And it's all focused on growing the area of sustainable finance. Hopefully that is an introduction that makes sense, but happy to answer more questions. And
yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. So now that you're a few years into the process, what do you think are some of the most important or most effective applications of blockchain to climate and coordination around climate change?
Well, I have to say, even though I'm going deeper into some of these things, the more made me realize the field is so big and it's growing so fast that it's now for me hard to keep track of everything. Well, I can tell you probably some of the things I've been involved. For example, emissions trading. We have been discussing some ideas there as proper implementation already. In fact, there are some examples out there. Or supply chain tracking. It's another very interesting area which is taking place across multiple domains, where there is, for example, tracking, for example, timber, wood that come from sustainable resources, to many other aspects of tracking supply chains. That I think is an area which is growing substantially, and now there are so many startups in the domain, in fact, which have things already working that it's hard to keep up. I cannot name them all, but I just was talking, in fact, last week with one of them that they were tracking diamonds, for example, and obviously they're already well positioned, well funded, because when tracking diamonds, the thing about diamonds is that diamonds is an industry where there are very few big players. And obviously, if you connect with them and then become an investor, you can literally track the rock from Africa to finally how it makes it into a ring of somebody. And obviously, in that case, even the additional cost that blockchain adds into it is not as much as, for example, compared with the price of the diamond, it's not really much. And it's really where I was seeing quite a lot of uptake. And in fact, on all the members of the blockchain, from the mines to the actual jewelries, they were all engaged. The jewelers actually were, and the customers ultimately that buy these diamonds, they were really engaged as well, knowing that it came from sustainable places. You didn't have black diamonds and things like that. So I think that is a good example, which, people talk about, there are all these possibilities that you can do with blockchain, but actually that is happening right now. And it seems to be going very well.
So that's an interesting one. I'm not sure I'm aware of how diamonds are related to climate change.
Oh, no. This is in general the topic of sustainability. So I do cover all the aspects of sustainability. Just good to mention, include 3 areas, or what we call in finance, ESG. Is for environmental aspects, S is for social aspects, and G is for governance.
Yeah, so the diamonds kind of falls into a human rights type of category.
Yes, the S part.
Absolutely.
The S part is a big problem when it comes to diamond. And again, this was an example I was trying to mention that it's actually scaling and it seems to have big uptake. We can talk about obviously the same idea on supply chain, for example, for food. And again, sustainable agriculture, which touches hugely on climate change, because if we talk about actually agriculture, potentially accounts for over 25% of global emissions when you could include everything. And obviously the problem is to try to add a blockchain across all of this has been facing challenges across the board. And I don't know if you've had experience, but my experience in some from those cases is that sometimes the additional cost is not justified. It's not uptake by everybody on the supply chain. And well, unfortunately, we end up where we are now that, there are not that many cases that are that successful. If that makes sense. So, I mean, a lot of, it would be great to have also, again, food in our plate or agriculture that comes and applies the most sustainable practices. And again, one of the key things about agriculture, if we talk about, the E aspect, the environmental aspect, is that agriculture, and particularly soil carbon, potentially is one of the big contributors of emissions, if we treat it bad, but it also could become one of the biggest solutions against climate change, because carbon can hold over 5 times the amount of carbon than the atmosphere. So when you actually start doing your math and start looking in detail, if you really want to start removing carbon out of the atmosphere, and avoid all these catastrophic events that we are having now with, for example, fires in California, well, the biggest pool of carbon is soil. And the ones that work on the soil are the farmers. So that could represent, for example, one of the biggest opportunities to help address climate change. And obviously, DLTs, distributed ledgers, could help on tracking, what actually is coming from good farmers and what is coming from farmers that are not doing their part and actually are making the problem worse. But unfortunately, yeah, it's hard. Farmers are not the same that the miners that I gave the example on the diamonds.
I've heard of some projects that are trying to offset emissions from flying using carbon sequestration in the soil. I've also heard of some blockchain projects that are interested in tracking the coffee supply chain, which I think is a big one. And also, I think another huge one is seafood, the fish supply, because people are very interested to know that their fish is actually what it says on the sticker, but it's also not coming from a place where they're not supposed to be fishing. So I think those are really big areas that I've read about. We've had a guest on, I can't remember, I think the project was called Nori, Nori. Or we wanted to have him on, but anyway, Nori, I need to remember exactly what happened with that, but they're doing an interesting carbon sequestration sort of trade-off with blockchain, which is pretty interesting. And I'm sure somebody else has another question for you, but I just wanted to interject and compliment you on the website that you have, because I just really enjoy that there are so many different articles there. So just for anybody who's going to be listening to this, if you go to blockchainclimate.org, if you just scroll down, you can see a bunch of different really fascinating articles that I imagine these are people who are part of the Institute, are writing. And I know there's one from you, which is all about green bonds. And so I just wanted to compliment you, because I think there's a lot of really great resources there that anybody can check out. So anyway, I'm sure somebody else has another question for you. This is great.
No, thanks, Nora. Yeah.
Of course.
Well, one thing that kind of triggered
Yeah,
me
I've
when
got
you
a
were
sort of
talking about.
technical question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
I've got a sort of technical sort of focus question. So, given the applications that you've seen, Pedro, your diamonds are not, there's not a lot of diamonds. So the scale you need to deal with diamonds is relatively small. The minute that you go to things like crops, particularly cash crops, you're talking about a blockchain that needs to scale a whole hell of a lot more than many. Have you seen that?
Yeah, no, excellent question, Steve. I totally agree on that point. And as you know, well, scalability is one of those aspects that blockchains community is trying to address, academics at uni and so on. I guess that this goes back, it's an area which is growing. I mean, in terms of scalability, for example, even thinking about actually the architecture of the data, of how it actually is stored, and even going for example, a DAX, a directed acidic graph, something like IOTA, instead of going, for an actually blockchain itself, is one of the questions that now is being explored across. And yeah, I don't know where things are going to go. It's actually it's not the aspects I'm actually focusing on the research. But yeah, I think what we can try to do, and the example of the diamonds, is to demonstrate to those not believers, which unfortunately is a huge community at the moment, especially because the information that they tend to gather when it comes to blockchain is about cryptos. Tell them that this technology can be used for many other things. Here is how it's working, and it's delivering value to the users. And the question is that, well, now that it's there, how do we scale it? How do we actually put more money into it to make it? And this is something that is happening actually across, or has happened recently. In fact, in other sectors, particularly in the area of climate change, like where we talk about the area of solar panels, and now it's happening with batteries. Thanks to this push and the demonstration that this technology has worked, now, well, solar panels have reached a price parity. So there are now many areas in which now you can put and invest in solar panels and solar farms, and it's actually as cheap as putting obviously there are different things there with taxes and so on, but it can reach the same level in terms of return investment than coal power plants. And this has happened in the past few years recently. And why has this happened? Well, because everybody sees the directions, everybody sees the demonstrations of the technologies, and they say, this is where we are going now. And this managed then through, well, a concerted effort. Obviously, there is competition to push the technologies to deliver more and more. And I believe blockchain will be there really soon, in fact. I think even faster than what happened with the solar panels. Solar panel, if you see the history, is about 30 years to get to the price where it is now. Those first solar panels in the 60s, 70s, and now where we are now. I think with the blockchain, we will be much faster there in terms of delivering things that work at a scale and don't cost a fortune. In fact, you get all the benefits with pretty much at the same cost than alternative technologies.
I mean, one of the things that I've found sort of looking at different blockchain projects is once you start having to deal with things that are concurrent by nature, things get a whole lot more tricky in terms of programming. Developers tend to make mistakes. They make mistakes on a sequential program. So, it's a lot easier to make them in a distributed world. And so more advanced notions of type that prevent those things from happening is part of the solution. And I think it's Greg that first suggested to me that the reason we don't see so many problems like this in blockchains of smart contracts now is because they haven't scaled yet enough for that to become a regular occurrence. There are a few, like the DAO bug, that have happened and they've been catastrophic. That would happen like regularly if you didn't have that more advanced notion of type. So there's two things, I think, that have to happen for distributed ledger technology with inbuilt trust mechanisms. Two things that fundamentally have to happen. And one is, making them scale. So getting away from proof of work, going to something else like proof of stake, which is something that we've done in our chain. And really good, as you mentioned, about the data, fundamental, because that governs how much you can shard and how much you can't. And if you know the causal nature of the communications, you can shard in really cool ways. Along with smart contract languages that do not get developers into a pickle, that they don't have those unintended consequences. And for me, that's kind of like the fundamental thrust that has to happen for blockchain to reach the next level. And it's actually why I joined our chain, because I think under our chain, we've got, I've seen lots of others. I mean, there's others, I won't name them particularly, but there are others that are using proof of stake and sharding. But when they get the scale, the problem that they will have is all of those unintended consequences, because they're using pretty traditional imperative sequential languages to drive the smart contracts. And once they start collaborating, they won't know what will hit them. So they're kind of, it's kind of a shitstorm waiting to happen.
Well, very good points, Steve. And I love to, well, I guess eventually, and this is something that have happened in databases anyway now, and we see it with NoSQL databases. And the CAP theorem, probably you're well aware, that you cannot really meet, all the three key points of the CAP theorem. Consistency, availability, and partitioning, and the partitioning, it's now there because of obviously the scale at which we're working and the amount of data and so on. And yeah, those are very interesting questions, which I have no clue how it will work in the DLT. I do have experience in non-DLT domains, and that's why we have different type of NoSQL databases, where there is, for example, Elastic or Cassandra, where they compromise in one of these aspects. You either compromise in consistency or in availability and so on, and at the end, you end up getting something to work. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's well, it shows that there are very interesting things coming along in the next few years, and we're still finding out many things.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think, is it's impossible to solve the general case because of CAP theorem. What's important is to recognize how people use and want to use and access their data and what they want to do with it, because the patterns of use will probably yield patterns in solutions that get us to the level of scale that we need. And that's been true forever in computer science.
Well, in particular, blockchain makes a pretty hard commitment. It says eventual consistency is the name of the game, right? And that's been the mantra within the industry for several decades now, right? I mean, that's exactly what's going on with Facebook, right? That's exactly what's going on with Google. Just look at the notifications, on your desktop and your mobile, right? You can see the eventual consistency happening right with your eyes. Right, so that's
agree.
And that's been at the backdrop of the most complex microservices architectures, is eventual consistency.
Yeah.
Correct.
And it's funny because I came from a database background way back when I used to write SQL compilers, and consistency was the god. And now we're prepared to sacrifice it, but we're prepared to sacrifice it because we now know in the internet world, the world of the web, that we never operate on the basis of consistency. We always operate on the basis of eventual consistency as human beings. So it kind of makes sense to reflect that back into architectures.
Indeed. So I'm very interested. One of the things we've found in trying to communicate to the blockchain community in particular, they're often very skeptical about climate and blockchain. And, they say, well, how can blockchain possibly help? Even a smart contracting blockchain, how can that help? And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're really focused on speculation. They're really focused on decentralized finance.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that. I'm so glad you're bringing this up.
So one of the things that I've tried to talk about is that most of the climate issues are really coordination issues, right? And I take a very large scale perspective, and I say, look, primates, Homo sapiens superpower is coordination, right? That's a hominid could not bring down a woolly mammoth by themselves, but working in concert and coordinating, they were able to basically, long before there was industrial culture, they were able to bring the mammoth populations they were decimated the mammoth populations. And that's just at the very beginning of the Homo sapiens, tour of duty on Earth. And now we've augmented our coordination superpower with three major tools. One of them is capital. There's no question that capital it augments the Homo sapiens coordination superpower. However, we're currently in a situation where we can't explore very many models, coordination models using capital, because capital is stuck in the hands of a few. And as a result, we're only able to explore a tiny slice of the total number of coordination models that are made available by capital. The other one, of course, is government and governance. And again, that has become centralized to nation states, which are moving very slowly and without a lot of global coordination. And climate change is a global phenomenon, not just a local phenomenon. And then finally, the social telecommunications, which are our most recent addition to the toolkit of primates coordination toolkit, that has also been massively centralized. And as a result, the internet was originally envisioned as a massively decentralized and distributed system, and it's been layered over with these sort of very, very heavily concentrated and centralized mechanisms, which again restricts the total amount of coordination that can happen. And the way I see blockchain is that it throws a monkey wrench into that. It makes it possible to reimagine capital as a coordinating device rather than as principally a store of value. It makes it possible to reimagine governance, right? And governance that now crosses nation-state boundaries and has direct participation as opposed to just representative participation, amongst other things. And it also allows for a decentralization of these social telecommunications technologies. So in that sense, blockchain is this massive disruption in terms of our coordinating toolkit. And then I start looking at all the coordination problems that are associated with climate change. So when I think about some of the things that you didn't mention, mostly have to do with dealing with the downstream effects of climate change. So, for example, there are already climate refugee problems. And in fact, many people argue that the Syrian refugee problem is really a climate refugee problem.
Absolutely, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. That
Yeah.
logically, that civil war would never have happened without an unprecedented drought, which destabilized everyone. Sorry, keep going.
No, you're absolutely right. But the issue is when refugees move from nation state to nation state, they leave behind a lot of their credentials, proof of identity, all of those kinds of things. And so it's difficult to identify who should get relief funds, who should be in line to participate in the workforce, and in what capacity. But if you were to put various aspects of credential and identity on chain in a public, decentralized manner, then suddenly a lot of that changes. But it also has knock-on consequences in terms of global governance, right? The more you have a decentralized public repository of identity, you also have the at least the beginnings of being able to participate in global questions about the distribution of resources. So those are some of the things that our chain thinks about and is actively working on. But I'm curious if you know of other groups or other folks who are working in these areas.
Well, it's totally agree, Greg, with these points. If I couldn't agree more, you know, that long-term vision. And in fact, about, was it 2 weeks ago when we have London Tech Week here, I was in a panel session and we were discussing some exactly similar ideas, you know, across the panel. So the idea, all these things, I think for those who know the domain and can see long term into the future, it is a huge disruptive force. No? Now the question is, how do we get there? Because obviously, as you mentioned, sometimes we're blocked not by technology. The technology, even though there are things to improve, and we're talking about scalability before, it's probably the biggest blockers are actually politicians, governments, or the people that essentially have that power now. And yeah, they obviously don't want to let it go. So yeah, I don't know how we're going to address that part. It's I think, well, having these conversations, getting to know each other, growing this community of believers, I think it's part of that. In terms of which other organizations I can mention, or well, their name escape a bit, you know, the specific group, but is part from the Red Cross in Madrid. When I met there, a few people, and some of them actually talking about blockchain, they were already testing some programs specifically about that part, what happens after the fact, after the disaster. And they were talking about these coupons, say a relief coupon that the Red Cross provided, that were only to spend on a specific needs and requirements for those refugees. And it was really interesting. I can dig actually the names if you want. I should have them somewhere there. And tell you know, they actually had some white paper that they produced at the end of last year, where they were actually talking about this specific case of how, you know, to use these type of DLTs for refugees support. So, but there are not that many. I mean, we need more of these examples. Obviously, Red Cross, by the way, they were interested as well to engage. So yeah, I'm happy to make that contact, guys.
That would be great.
Yes. We'll follow up with some emails, Daryl.
Yeah.
You know, I'll dig the paper and potentially the names of the guys working on that project with the Red Cross.
I mean, given what you guys do on sort of trying to influence policy, so for me, and this is just the way I see the world, the biggest problem that's led to us having this very oil-based economy, this carbon economy that's very bad for us, has been largely because the UN system of national accounts doesn't lend itself to the right sort of changes. So at the turn of last century, you know, the UN system of national accounts was developed, and GDP was born, right? And out of GDP comes, it drives policy for many governments on a nation state basis. And that's because what they've got is a ledger per nation, right? Owned by that government that says what's valuable and what isn't. You know, and it's interesting to reflect on that. So let me ask you a question. What was the best value returning oil tanker ever in the planet? What do you think the best? You're going to be surprised. It was the Exxon Valdez. Do you remember the one that crashed?
Oh, that was one of the worst oil spills ever, right?
And as a result, and the way that the UN system of national accounts worked, it became the biggest contributor to the US gross domestic product of any oil tanker that has ever been launched.
Gosh.
Right?
Well,
now, isn't that
also
strange? Right,
yes,
somehow. And the reason it is the case is because there was no counting. There was no counting of what it did that was bad. There was only the counting of revenue, salaries of people doing the clear up that contributed to GDP. They never counted the birds that died. They never counted the trees that died. And it would be great if we had a global ledger for trees, for instance, where it was, where we could see that when it was more beneficial to leave a tree living than cutting it down, and equally not planting a tree that shouldn't be where somebody wants to plant it. So, but the only way to do that is to have a policy that enables a global ledger to have it, because if without a global ledger, you can't influence all the countries. It goes back to Greg's coordination thing. By having a global ledger that measures real value that people are truly interested in some way, that's one way in which you change policy.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's a global ledger, it's public, and it's you can't do anything fraudulent on it or change history, means that policymakers then have to take it seriously.
Yeah, you can't put a PR spin on a blockchain, really.
Exactly. Yeah.
But there's one thing I wanted to say, though, in relation to that, and I feel like I'm talking about him all the time, but Andrew Yang, who's so great, ran for president of the United States, for those who don't know. One of his major talking points in his speeches about, the state of not only America, but the world, was about how GDP was a terrible way to measure the health and the prosperity of a nation and its people. That GDP was, and actually the inventor of GDP explicitly said, please don't use this as an index for the health of the nation. This is a financial measurement, you know what I mean? And of course, what do? If GDP is good, we ignore all the cancer, all the homelessness, suicide rates, environmental catastrophe, and so on and so forth, which is really interesting. But I did want to bring in, I'm not sure if Ian or Daryl have a question or just something they wanted to mention, but I just wanted to invite them because they haven't gotten a chance to talk very much yet, although Daryl may have stepped away for a moment. But
oh, I just put in the chat a couple ESG ratings agencies because they try to capture some of this.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ian. And also I put in the chat just a few minutes ago, usually when we don't have a guest, and having a guest is way better, but when we don't have a guest, I usually bring some articles to speak about that are, headlines in the tech or climate sort of community. And I just wanted to draw attention to this for people who are going to be listening, that CNN did a piece estimating there'd be 1.2 billion with a B climate refugees by 2050. And that is such an interesting time because that's 30 years from now. And of course, 2050 is the same distance from now that 1990 is. And people don't seem to realize that, how soon it really is. When we talk about 2050, it's very, very fast, 1990 was not all that long ago, I hear from people. So that's something to consider.
I also want to go back and ask a few more questions of our guests.
Yes.
So part of the reason I was setting up the discussion of coordination is because I also want to look realistically at where the technology will be and what we can expect of it in various timeframes. So in particular, one of the things that I've tried to argue as strenuously as I can is that the technology is very nascent and it won't be reliable for at least a decade. And if you look at all other technologies sort of like this is generous, right? It's actually more likely that it'll be 20 years, but let's assume that a lot of time and attention and and other resources are poured into the blockchain side of this equation, then it's, you know, it might be ready to handle mission critical applications within a decade. So what that says is that pursuing things like finance is probably not a good idea. And pursuing things like supply chain management is probably not a good idea. Because if you have life or significant property on the line for an unreliable technology, you're going to have these major catastrophic events, which we have already seen happening with these technologies, and everyone will suffer. However, if we take a small step back and look at how the internet has developed, right? Google in the 1990s, Google made a brilliant observation. Hey, we can improve internet search with the PageRank algorithm. And, you know, they put up a single page with a single button. I'm feeling lucky. And it turned into this massive, massive win for Sergey and Eric Schmidt and Larry. So the issue, that particular idea of going after high transaction, low risk kinds of applications has been repeated again and again and again over the last 20 or 30 years. So, you know, from Google to Facebook to Instagram to Spotify, on and on and on and on. And the biggest economies in the world now are built on these high transaction volume, low risk kinds of applications. And that seems to be a great place to test out blockchain technologies. You can still make a killing if that's what floats your boat. But you can start to you can start it out and prove it out at scale without putting so much at risk. If you were to build for example, a Spotify-like service, nobody dies if a song doesn't get delivered. But if you misdeliver a pallet of food or a pallet of drugs, you're in deep shit. People can die. And so my argument has been that when we're starting to think about these technologies, let's just learn about internet, from the lessons of the internet technologies that have been, made clear to us for the last 30 years, and then move from there to these more, these riskier things. And from that matrix, overlay those concerns on how we begin to address climate. So again, start with coordination problems where nobody dies. A simple example, tree planting and carbon sequestration. Nobody's going to die in a tracking mechanism like that. And that's an interesting coordination problem, right? You get a bunch of volunteers out there planting trees, and for every tree planted, there's a capacity that can be sold to offset someone else's carbon burden, right? That nobody's going to die in that situation. But do you get my point? Do you understand? It's a fairly broad scale point. It involves a lot of different moving parts, but I think that the argument, holds water. But I'm curious as to what your thought process is and how that relates to BCI in general. Yeah.
No, I do agree with the general points. In fact, that long-term vision and the timeline that you mentioned, actually, it's for me make total sense. That's actually why I kind of like to go back to academia and spend time with academics to see, okay, how do you plan to address this and how you plan to address that. I do agree as well with the idea of high risk versus low risk. It makes very good sense. I guess that the reason why, for example, in my case, why I decided to spend some time on this is because I've done, my background normally is consultancy. So I've been doing consultancy now for 6 years. Well, my background actually used to be very academic. I used to be at Imperial, yeah, did PhD, postdoc. I was a lecturer as well. So I was teaching, and when I realized, okay, I'm not really like teaching that much, I left. And I've been now doing consulting in industry. By the way, for machine learning, AI. So actually, that's mainly my domain, more than DLTs. But lots of coding, as you can imagine. And one of the things that I've learned, having spent time as well at a big financial organization like HSBC, that all these big organizations, they are also going through a lot of transformation. And I actually call it digital transformation. It's a very well-known, actually, tagline that is used to involve many things, in fact, sometimes too many. And one of the key things that is happening there, and it's not just in finance, but across the board organization, because, you know, I've worked with a real economy companies, like, for example, here in the UK, you know, I've done work with Heathrow Airport. I've done work with London Underground, and so on and so on. And it's this idea of automation. There is so much manual work that has nothing to do with DLT or with the AI for that matter, even though sometimes when I talk to a client, what I sell is the AI. In fact, what we're talking is just simple boilerplate codes that really automate things that shouldn't be not done by humans anymore. And that's probably more the angle that I have probably applied to a lot of this. So for example, in the case of blockchain green bonds that we have there are so many things that can be automated. And again, it doesn't, you know, they probably will put the blockchain as a cherry on the cake, but it's about automating and digitizing many aspects that can be automated, can be digitized, but it hasn't been done. And it's because a lot of these organizations are going through this digital transformation process, where literally some of them are still even using, you know, pen and paper for some things, where, you know, they should be using an app or many other things that, you know, now are possible, and are, going back to your point, are extremely low risk, guarantee success, but they haven't done it yet. So I think those are maybe the key things that I'm actually been building, and that actually I would put a lot of attention, including legal aspects and so on, and where the DLT will be literally one of the components that we can just take out and put a new one. So we're doing and trying to build things in a very abstract way, where we don't depend on a specific DLT. And this is one of the key things I have in mind, you know, for all the research I'm doing on DLT. I'm assuming that whatever DLT I'm using now, it could be replaced tomorrow. And I'm actually focused on all these other aspects that unfortunately they hold progress. And in fact, that's the reason sometimes when they come, you need to hire, you know, consultants on that. They, you know, it shouldn't be because there are easy things. And I have to say, you know, I don't want to say sometimes too loud, because then the client will say, oh, well, so we pay you so much, and, you know, where you're doing, you say easy things, but in fact, it ends up going to that. It ends up going back to politics and culture, you know, meeting people that essentially, I had that actually many times, where they say, I've been doing this for 40 years. You know, when you, Greg, when you talk about, you know, the way how the system have worked for the past, centralized, doing specific things. And when you come and trying to teach them new ways of doing these things, they say, you want to teach me to do this when I've been doing this longer than you are alive. You know, and, you know, I'm around 40. And it becomes a challenge, I have to say, because, you know, even though, you know, I'm right, you know, I'll say we are on the right side, Greg, of all this new tech. The fact is that you cannot ignore all this experience of people that have been doing certain things in certain ways. And it's a long process as well, and probably also will take several years just for people to adjust. Not to DLTs. In fact, we can remove the DLTs and blockchains completely out of the conversation. And still, I can be telling you exactly the same things, because they still are using things and doing things that are from last century. And yeah, because let's remember, you know, most companies, most organizations are not Google or Facebook. Especially, for example, here in the UK, we talk about manufacturing, all this real economy, which I really like to work with. They are working with things that you cannot imagine. You say, why are they still doing these things? So yeah, I guess that would be, my main argument why I'm even doing things that seem at very high risk. But in reality, the way I'm working on them is really very holistically to try to bring even the people on board and the whole supply chain and the whole system. And the DLT aspect is a plug and play aspect. Yeah. Don't know if that answered the question, Greg, maybe?
That was great.
Yeah.
And well, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I guess I wanted to ask if Daryl or anybody else who hasn't said much wanted to just, add in anything, but we only have a couple of minutes.
Oh man, I mean, I have so many things I'd love to talk about now. It's just opened up so much more. But I'm just going to say one thing, and that is that you have converted me today, and you've converted me away from using the term blockchain to using the term DLT. I think I'm going to start doing that all the time now because it's just more accurate, especially when trying to explain our chain. It's when you think of a blockchain, you think of this kind of serial thing with a link that goes up to another link. That's what you think of when a chain is. It's a singular thing. That doesn't actually explain our chain very well. So DLT is a little more open-ended. So thank you for that.
I do want to interject. The issue though with DLT is that it puts the emphasis on ledger, and our chain is decidedly not a ledger.
Okay. So we still need a new word.
Yes, we do. Indeed. Yes.
Probably. And just one thing for you, Pedro. Given that you and I are both in the UK, I will endeavour to get your details. I think I have them. And I shall reach out to you because I think there's several conversations I would like to have with you, particularly from a policy formulation perspective. I was involved with helping Jeremy Corbyn in those days write his digital manifesto. And that included a platform that was trusted for mass deliberation and voting. And those two things are actually at the heart of the dApps that are being developed right now on top of our chain.
Sounds really exciting, guys.
But I'll pick that up with you and talk to you about that and see whether there's synergy there that can be had, because maybe that has a real role in the whole climate debate. I think it may well do.
Definitely, and I'm sure there are so many connections now to be made. And I want to thank you, Pedro, for joining us today. This has been really awesome to hear from you, and I'm sure many members of our community are going to be interested to look up the Institute, and it's blockchainclimate.org. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Daryl, for making this connection and for bringing you on. And yeah, I'm really grateful to have this conversation. And of course, for anybody who's listening, you can subscribe to our chain on YouTube. We're going to have more guests and do more talks soon. And you can become a member of our chain at ourchain.coop. And if you would like to be a guest or know somebody who would like to be a guest, you can email us at climate@ourchain.coop. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. I wanted to really thank you, the conversation, the questions, and yeah, definitely, Greg and Steve, we really share many of the views. So you should definitely stay in touch. So
absolutely.
Yeah, Greg and I are almost like twins.
Okay.
We're nearly the same age. And when you said people that have been doing this job for 40 years, my heart dropped because I have been.
Oh, okay. So,
I'm 61 on Thursday.
Oh, okay. Happy early birthday, Steve.
So, by the way, sorry, I apologize for it, but I just was.
No, it was very true. I'm not the normal 61-year-old, as I'm sure all people attest to.
No, it's hard to change people, but yeah, hopefully, well, I think we're going to make it. It will take time, but yeah, it's good to have these communities and these type of conversations. Yes.
Yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Well, I shall certainly connect as the local R-Chain guy. So, and I'm sure Greg will want to have another conversation. And Daryl's just itching. And Nora will shed light over all of us.
Oh, so
Good.
sweet.
Nice meeting
Okay.
you.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks to all.
Bye bye.
Okay.
Have a good weekend.
And
Bye-bye.
you. Yes,
Pedro.
absolutely.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.